And we are recording. All right, so we are here with Brother Adam Alsobrook of University Lodge 141 in Seattle, Washington. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
All right, now before we get started, I do have to make a couple of announcements. First, I got to say a big thank you to University Lodge and your secretary in particular. I've been in contact with your lodge. I've had the Worshipful Master, Worship Brother Ben Stagner, on the podcast. And today in the mail, I received this. It's going to be awesome University Lodge, with very cool logo, by the way, University 141 Lodge koozie, and a letter from your brother secretary saying, "We hope you enjoy many delicious beverages with it," which I intend to. So thank you so much for that.
You're very welcome.
And the other thing is, I mentioned this at the start of all my podcasts. I'm going to put the flyer up on the screen. December 30th, December 31st, and January 1st, Square and Compass is sponsoring blood clinics at Canadian Blood Services. Anybody who donates on those days will be eligible to win prizes donated by Square and Compass Promotions, including a scale model of our beautiful Windsor Masonic Temple. So if you haven't done so yet, and you live in the Windsor or Essex area, please book an appointment to donate blood. The need is as great as ever, especially under current circumstances, and the process is very safe. They're taking all the precautions to make sure everybody is as safe as possible. And with that, once again, welcome, Brother Alsobrook.
Thank you very much for having me.
What's before we get started on your lodge, what's behind you? Is that your Masonic Temple? In which case, very cool.
No, actually, what is featured on the screen behind me, virtually, of course, is actually a part of the murals on the walls of our lodge room, which were painted by Seattle artist Ernest Norling in 1950. And Norling was, a noted Pacific Northwest artist and muralist. And according to an art historian who is knowledgeable of Norling's work, the murals on all four walls of our lodge room are the largest existing Norling murals that remain in their original location anywhere. He was prolific, but unfortunately, some of his works have been lost over time. So we're very fortunate to have very, very beautiful lodge room that we paid a very small pittance for. It was $2,000 in 1950, which even in 1950 money translated today with inflation, it's just really, I think we got a bargain. But they're very realistic, and they depict, of course, in the eastern part of the room, they depict King Solomon's Temple, and then on the other three walls, they depict other scenes, from different major periods of architectural history, in kind of a vague Middle Eastern, historic context. So we're very lucky to have them.
Now you came to my attention through your secretary and your worshipful master in particular. They advised that you had a lot of information about the history of University Lodge. One thing I love doing is when I can, to travel and visit Masonic temples and lodges in person to get a chance to tour them and learn about their history. But over the last several months, I've had the opportunity to focus on doing it more virtually through Zoom and GoToMeeting, things like that. So I guess my question is, before we go into the actual history of your temple and your lodge itself, is I don't know if Seattle has gone through the same lockdowns as Windsor and other places, but have you found, um, you know, to share this information, to share this history, have you been using Zoom and other virtual means, and have you found that's increased over the last few months?
Absolutely. I've actually, I first gave a presentation of the kind of my findings of the history of the lodge. I gave the first presentation was really, well, actually, excuse me, I've done three presentations on the history of the lodge. The first was for a event held by Historic Seattle, which is a local historic preservation organization here in Seattle. And that was back in, they had an open house at our lodge back in, I believe it was May of 2019. And, so in pre-COVID days. And, they had a members event there, members meeting, and also, members of our lodge were on hand to give a history of the lodge. So the first presentation of the history of the building I gave at that event. Then over a period of time, I compiled much more research on the history of the building, which actually I just recently self-published to my website. I operate my own website where I can, exercise total control over what I post, and that is AdamAlsobrook.net, and it's ADAMALSOBROOK.net. And so all of my research and writing, on various Masonic building topics, in principally just Seattle and Washington State right now, but eventually might be looking at some other locations. That was posted on there. And so that paper, that research paper, which I really kind of finished over this past summer, was presented to the lodge in a Zoom meeting in September of this year. And after that presentation, I was then asked by the Brethren of St. John's Lodge, number 9 here in Seattle, which is the oldest lodge in Seattle. They were chartered in 1860. And the oldest lodge in Seattle. They were our mother sponsor lodge. When University Lodge sought dispensation and a charter from the Grand Lodge of Washington in 1904. And so presenting on Zoom, has its challenges. It's when you just present your slideshow in Zoom. I've found that if I ever do it again, I would do it as a webinar, so that you can just give your presentation and then people can ask questions, rather than just kind of the regular format for Zoom is not necessarily conducive to smooth presentations. But there has been much more interest in a wide variety of topics, beyond just having social events on Zoom. So.
You mentioned, your research. What were your sources for finding out about the history of University Lodge?
Oh gosh. I was fortunate to have done most of the history prior to a lot of the local archives and institutions closing related to the ongoing pandemic. And the sources ranged from, the records and the minutes of the lodge, held in our archive, and then also newspapers, so the Seattle Times and the Seattle Post-Intelligencer, which were the two newspapers in Seattle, both of which still operate in various forms. And then also building trade publications were especially helpful in determining, when the building permit was issued and who was the actual designer of the building, and when it was built and things of that nature. And so, we were also fortunate to have, we don't have the original drawings of the building from 1909, but we do have a small set of drawings, sketches, really, blueprints that were prepared by worshipful brother Harry E. Hudson, who was a noted Seattle architect, very prolific, did a lot of houses. He was also kind of a early design build kind of guy, and was worshipful master of our lodge in 1921. And so we have some drawings of his from the early 1920s, that we were able to kind of compare against, building permit records and things like that. So it really was a deep dive, using not only just local archives, in particular, the Museum of History and Industry here in Seattle was particularly helpful. They hold in their collections the earliest historic photograph that we have of our building, which was taken in 1910, not long after it was finished. And we were very fortunate to be able to obtain the rights to reproduce that photograph, both in our presentations and in my written works that are published online. But MOHI has been tremendous, always have been tremendous, and they continually support my other research efforts in Masonic buildings in Seattle. So really left no stone unturned while doing the research on this building.
All right, so let's go into the actual research itself and the actual findings. So, was your research focused on the building itself, or the Masonic lodge within, or a combination of both? Where would you say the majority of the focus was?
Oh, very interesting question. It really started out as being an investigation to answer a question that I had, which was who designed and who constructed the building. And then by the time the research progressed and the writing progressed, it became much more of a kind of an interplay between the history of the lodge and also the history of the building itself. And so it was really kind of, it ended up being in a very organic process. But I'd say that it started out about the building and then ended up being a little bit about both.
So do you want to kind of take us through your findings, starting with however you want to start, but starting with the designer and then kind of moving forward to the highlights?
Yes, let me bring up my cheat sheet. Just 1 second, please. I must apologize. I'm an architectural historian in my day job, and so sometimes it's a little bit difficult to shift gears.
No worries.
So,
We've got a lot of I've done a lot of videos about the architecture and the heritage of the Windsor Masonic Temple. We've reviewed the original blueprints from the 1920s. Our building was built in 1921. Also done a lot of interviews with historians, or with architects and heritage specialists, preservation specialists. Masonic temples are, the golden age of Masonic temple building was 1870 to 1930. So those Masonic temples that have managed to remain, a lot of them unfortunately were sold off over the years, but those that managed to continue being Masonic temples, I mean, they're all kind of struggling from the same issues related to upkeep and just the challenges that come with the heritage property.
right, exactly. I'm not familiar with the Windsor Temple. It's a building that I'm not familiar with. Do you remember who the architect was of the Windsor Temple?
Yeah, a gentleman named James Carlisle Pennington. He was a a Mason, a pretty prolific Mason in the Windsor, Essex area. He also designed actually our neighbors, the Hotel Dieu Hospital. He designed the later additions to that, a lot of municipal buildings, a lot of houses. Yeah, so he designed it for the cost at the time was 200,000. So extrapolate that, you're talking in the 20, I think it was 21 million in today's dollars. Yeah, we've got, I'll put the links up in this video right now, but we've also got, you know, a few videos about the architecture of the building. I'll send them your way.
Thank you. I do recognize the name of Bennington. You know, there was a lot of interplay between the architects in the Pacific Northwest, and it wasn't just limited to Canada. In the United States, it's like there were architects in the United States who practiced in Canada and vice versa. It was a very interesting, you know, kind of time period where the border was much more fluid than what it currently is today. But the origins of our excuse me, let me just find my bookmark. The first discussions about forming a Masonic lodge in the University District of Seattle, which is where our lodge is still located, those discussions began in the summer of 1904, and a group of our charter members, a small group of Masons who were members of St. John's, and mostly of St. John's, but of some of the other lodges in Seattle, met in the real estate office of one of the brethren of the lodge, Worshipful Brother Fred Rood, who was a real estate agent and developer, principally in what was then known as University Station, just west of the University of Washington. And one of the first newspaper announcements that we were able to find was actually from August 31st, 1904, when it was announced that a group of Masons in the University District wanted to create a new lodge and receive a dispensation. And ultimately, we received our dispensation in, excuse me, late 1904. Excuse me. And then we received our charter in June 1905. And what was really fascinating is that at the time, well, up until fairly recently, the Grand Lodge of Washington also was in charge, not only of, had dominion over Masonic lodges in Washington state, but also in Alaska. So, you know, they had charge of lodges in Alaska. And at the same meeting of the Grand Lodge in June of 1905, the numbering of our lodge and Anvil Lodge in Nome, Alaska was actually confused. Our Grand Secretary at the time was really ill and ultimately died later in 1905. Excuse me. And so there was a little bit of confusion over our numbering. And so we were in University Lodge was initially number 140, and then Anvil Lodge was 141, but ultimately those numbers were flipped so that Anvil ended up being 140 and we ended up being 141. And of course, when when the Alaska created their Grand Lodge, I believe it was in the late 1990s or the early 2000s, all the lodges were renumbered in the order that they were chartered up there. And so initially, for the first few years that our lodge met, we met in a rented hall on the second floor of a space known as Sherrick's Hall. Excuse me. And Sherrick's Hall was located at the southwest corner of what is now Northeast 42nd Street and University Way in the University District, a few blocks south of where we currently have our lodge. And we met there until, just all the various organizations. Sherrick's Hall was one of the only large meeting spaces in University Station. And so, the lodge, had to share with a lot of other organizations in that meeting space. And so, very quickly discussions began about the possibility of constructing an actual lodge building to house University Lodge number 141. And so those discussions continued, from the early days, like 1907 into 1908. And then in October of 1908, the Brethren actually acquired a property in the University Station University District, and located at the southeast corner of Northeast 45th Street and University Way. And that was where that was selected as the site for our new building. And the plans, the newspaper announcement said that the plans had not been announced yet at that time. And there was actually like relatively little, really covered in the newspapers, at all. Seattle Times, Seattle Post-Intelligencer, as far as I can tell, I've not been able to locate any mention of the actual construction of the building until after it was long completed. And my thinking, for why this was the case is due to the 1909 Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, which took place on what is now the grounds in the University of Washington. And that World's Fair took place, and there was a building called the Masonic Building at the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition. And our building was also called the Masonic Building. And so I believe that our Masonic Building got completely overshadowed by the much more prominent but temporary Masonic Building that was built at the 1909 AYPE. And so it was an initial stumbling block to the research to just kind of hit this wall and realize, when I was looking at the newspapers, that they were talking about a building that was not our building, it was another building entirely. And so that ultimately, I split off that as a whole separate project because it just turned into a rabbit hole that needed further exploration. So the Masonic Building at the 1909 Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition got split off into its own research effort, while I continued to concentrate on the research efforts on our building. And so ultimately, I discovered through building permit records that a Norwegian immigrant by the name of John Schultz designed and constructed our building that we use to this day. And it's a load-bearing brick masonry building with a wood frame structure on the interior. And Schultz was what would best be described in today's terminology as a structural engineer. He had received his education in Norway and immigrated to the United States in 1890. Worked in a variety of roles, including for a period of time for the American Bridge Company, which constructed massive steel bridges for railroads and highways in the early 20th century. And he ended up moving to the West Coast by the early 1900s and settled first in San Francisco. And following the San Francisco earthquake of April 1906, he was instrumental in the rebuilding of San Francisco, creating fireproof and earthquake-resistant buildings, tall buildings, very large buildings. And he ended up coming to Seattle in 1907 where he first worked for the City of Seattle Building Department as the Assistant Superintendent of Buildings. And what was really interesting is, and I've recently done some additional research into the building department, but the building department, when Schultz joined the building department as Assistant Superintendent of Buildings, the building department was headed by an architect by the name of William Grant, who was actually a Mason, and very prominent Mason, charter member of the Nile Shrine, very, very active in Seattle Masonic circles, and later actually designed a Masonic Temple in Shoreline in the early 1920s. But so Schultz ended up working in the same department as Grant. What's really interesting is that I have uncovered no indication that Schultz was a Mason. I've been in contact with one of his descendants who lives in Southern California, who, when I contacted her through Ancestry, she was completely over the moon because nobody in their family had known anything about their ancestors' activities in Seattle and all the buildings that he worked on here and also in San Francisco. But as far as I can tell, he was not a Mason. And there's really no indication, there's no evidence or proof as to how he came to be associated with the University Lodge number 141 and how he ended up creating their building. And so it just kind of seems like a matter of expediency. They needed a building constructed, and he was a very competent designer. I can make all sorts of speculation about how that happened, but unfortunately I can't prove any of it. I think we all know how the Masonic telegraph works, and how we communicate amongst ourselves. So, it's highly likely, that someone talked to someone, and he ended up doing the building. But it was constructed very rapidly. It was constructed, for a very reasonable amount of money, which is certainly not the case when it comes to construction these days. And let's see if I can find that number. I think it was something like $18,000 or something like that. It was a very, very small number. $12,000. It was constructed for $12,000. Was the building permit valuation, which equates to $328,000 in today's money. Unfortunately, the City of Seattle Building Department operations at that time, they discarded all the building plans after a year and only retained a small handful of the building plans of some of the more prominent buildings in Seattle. And so unfortunately, we don't have a copy of the original drawings. But the building was complete in time for the first meeting to take place in the building on October 18th, 1909. And what's really interesting is that I'm still trying to discover if our building was actually ever formally dedicated. It appears that it may not have actually ever been formally dedicated. And it also does not have a cornerstone, which cornerstones are usually a very important part of Masonic buildings. In many cases, when possible, the cornerstone is placed in the same position on the building, from building to building. So it's really kind of interesting. The building was finished and just put into use almost immediately with no discussion. The first newspaper reference to the building actually being used and opened, the first reference that I came across in the newspaper was actually about another fraternal organization using the building, because the Order of the Eastern Star used it, and also the what is now a very politically incorrect fraternal order. I think it was the Order of Red Men, which also met in the building initially. But we were very fortunate, to have, excuse me, we were very fortunate to have that early photograph of the building, that shows what the building looked like, not long after it was finished. And so that photo was just really, it provided a wealth of information about, some of the other things, that went on with the building. The University Station branch post office was located on the ground floor of our building from 1909 until 1914, and so that U.S. government lease, the power of that lease helped us finance the original construction of the building. And so there was retail spaces and a post office on the ground floor, and then on the second floor, doctors and dentists ended up having some offices up there to kind of help defray the ongoing operating costs of the building. And so, it really started out as just trying to find out who the architect and builder of the building was, and they were one and the same. It was this John Schultz gentleman, and ultimately he ended up leaving Seattle not long after our building was finished, and had a very long career in Southern California, in Long Beach, and in the Venice area around Los Angeles. And ultimately, they ended up, the family changed their name in 1918 because it sounded too German, and so there was a lot of anti-German sentiment related to World War I. And he died in the early 1930s. But it's a complete mystery as to how he came to be the architect and builder of our lodge. Especially when it's like compared against all the other research that I've been doing on other Masonic buildings in Seattle, and then that they were designed by architects who were also Masons. Probably the most prominent example is the original Maine Masonic Temple that was located at Harvard and Pine, in what is now the Capitol Hill neighborhood. And that was designed by the architects Saunders and Lawton. And the competition for that building that was held in, I believe it was 1910 or 1911, that competition was only open to Masonic architects. And so, I believe it was something like 12 or 13 architects and architecture firms competed against each other for that. So, in kind of summary, I mean, our building kind of ended up being just, even though it has ended up being extremely significant as what I believe, what my research indicates, is the second oldest purpose-built Masonic lodge building in Seattle. There's other older ones in King County, where Seattle is located, but within the city limits of Seattle, we have the second oldest Masonic lodge building. And it just really got kind of lost in the shuffle, is probably the best way to describe it. There was just so much going on in Seattle at the time period, and so much going on in Freemasonry in general, that it just kind of, that early history just got lost by the wayside. So it really ended up being just a reclamation of that history, rediscovery and reclamation of that history. But it ended up being, I think, much more fascinating than anybody initially believed, because.
How did this goes back to something you mentioned way at the start? But
sorry.
That was really cool. I didn't want to interrupt you at the time. I just kept it in my head. I don't even know if this, like, if you would have came across this in your research, but you mentioned that at the time, in 1904, early 20th century, Grand Lodge of Washington was also covered Alaska, and Masonic lodges in Alaska. How, like, did you come across any information just about how it was able to like the communications from Seattle to, were people sending, was Canada sending people go through? Were they taking boats? Like, how did we have a hard enough time communicating between lodges that meet in the same building, let alone traverse a country. Was there any information about, and does that have anything to do with the number issue, just the length of time it would take to get a message back and forth? I would imagine it'd be very interesting, situation.
Yeah, it is something that I initially started poking around in, and I recently discovered that that had already been very extensively researched by the current Grand Historian of the Grand Lodge of Alaska. I believe that's Most Worshipful Brother. I think it's John Adamson. I might be misquoting his name, but regardless, he wrote a truly magisterial doorstop of a study of the Masonic lodge, the Masonic clubs and lodges in Alaska from the first days as a territory after the United States purchased it from Russia. And I want to say that his work is something like 500 pages long, fully illustrated, heavily researched, cited and whatnot. But and so I ended up coming across his work, which unfortunately I'm currently unable to obtain through interlibrary loan, thanks to the pandemic. But I look forward to eventually being able to review his full work and sit down and actually use it as a source. But to answer your question, I believe that the communication between the Grand Lodge of Washington, which was based in Olympia, and later Tacoma, that communication with this far off distant outpost, on the northern frontier, I believe the communication was very, very, very difficult. And I think that it was a contributing factor to, the numbering mistake, between Anvil Lodge and University Lodge. I think that, letters took a while, communication was by ship. You were able to send, there was not telephone service, but you could send telegrams, and cablegrams. There was a military cable that connected, Seattle with various ports in Alaska. And that was the early communication system, was through a very expensive, it was kind of the equivalent of like Federal Express, today, FedEx, where you're spending, maybe $100, to get an overnight package somewhere. It's kind of the equivalent of that. But the communication was extremely difficult. But the vast wealth of some of the Alaska lodges, the Anvil Lodge, their annual dues, adjusted for inflation to 2020 US dollars, their annual dues were almost $3,000 a year. And they had a very, very wealthy, very, very wealthy group of brethren who were all like merchants and gold miners. But
was Alaska a wealthy place at the time? I always imagined Alaska as being kind of a rugged, not so. Well, I guess but Yukon's up there, Yukon gold. So I guess was it a wealthy place?
It was. I wouldn't say that it was necessarily, wealthy for everybody. I would say, just like any other economic system, you have the haves and the have-nots. And I imagine that the earlier you were able to go up there and establish your gold claim, and hopefully it turned out to be a paying claim. Those gold prospectors, made money. But I actually think that it was the merchants, the businessmen and the merchants and the real estate agents who, did all the transactions and the support for the mining operations. I think they actually ended up being much more wealthier, because they could charge just obscene prices for the most basic essentials. Because every prospector going into the Yukon had to carry a year's worth of supplies to support one person, and so you had to carry all of that, over the infamous pass that, the name escapes me right now. But wealthy, there were certainly wealthy people in Alaska, but the various fraternal orders like the Masons, the Alaska Brotherhood, the Arctic Brotherhood, and the Fraternal Order of Eagles, all built relatively large buildings. The Elks, in particular, built massive fraternal buildings in Alaska. So
Have you
there,
had a chance?
there definitely was wealth, yeah.
Have you had the chance to visit? I would love to see some Alaska Masonic temples.
So, unfortunately,
I mean, you can't now, but
well, unfortunately, you can't now, but unfortunately, you can't. In many cases, they most of their buildings, most of their early Masonic buildings no longer exist. I believe that the oldest existing Masonic building in Alaska is located in Skagway. They were chartered very, very early on. I forget the exact date. I think it was 1900 or 1901. But the Skagway Lodge still meets in their original building. There's a couple of other lodges, but many of them have been lost to fires. The lodge in Fairbanks was lost several years ago because snow caved in the roof and it destroyed half the building, and they had to demolish it. But there are a handful of existing historic lodges that are left, and in part of my research, I went down a rabbit hole and I started collecting, some postcard images of some of the Alaska lodges, and some of them were very, very prominent buildings, and there is, I believe, one of the most prominent historic Masonic Lodge buildings that they have is in but it's a government office building now. So it is something that I'm doing more research on to really see, when we are able to travel again, what we can go see in Alaska.
what is the was that kind of one of your motivations for joining Freemasonry? Is because it seems like the not so much Alaska necessarily, but just the historic nature of the craft and the buildings, especially with your profession. And it sounds like it's something that you have really dedicated yourself to, is this research on the historical buildings and the architects and the people behind them. Was that an initial motivation for joining, or is that something that you discovered after joining?
It was actually something that I'd always been interested in. One of my previous positions, I worked for the State Historic Preservation Office in Texas, and I visited several Masonic buildings in Texas, and was always intrigued about the sheer breadth of building types, and they came in all shapes and sizes, and they were grand, and they were plain or grand, or just this wide variety of architectural styles, and that was definitely an initial fascination, and continue to be a fascination when because I'm a relatively recent addition to the ranks of the Brethren of University Lodge number 141. I was only raised to the third degree in April of 2019. So came to it relatively late in life, but the architecture definitely, it's one of the things that's really come to fascinate me is how much we really don't know about it. There is one book that I've come across that specifically analyzes from an architectural history point of view Masonic temples, and I believe
William Moore.
Yes. And so what's really interesting is that, of course, he, like many other, I believe his background was, he either was or still is an archivist at the Grand Lodge of New York's archive. And so he has all this, I'm sorry, go ahead.
He's been a guest on my podcast. I had him, I interviewed him. He is not a Mason himself. It's interesting. He just was, so right now he's with Boston University. He is the director of the New England and Boston History Department. The director of it, and history professor. So he wasn't actually a Mason himself, but he was able to connect with the Grand Lodge of New York and receive permission to go through their archives and gather the information necessary for his work. Still not a Mason even after, which I was surprised at. Oftentimes, even in your case, right? A lot of times people will start with an interest in some particular aspect of Freemasonry, whether it's the architecture or they could have a family connection, or they could be interested in the history or some of the more, woo-woo aspects of it, that type of thing. And they'll end up joining for that reason. He himself never joined, but he still does research on the topic. And we had a great podcast interview, talked to him for, I think at the time he might have been my longest interview. He was, I think close to an hour. But yeah, William Moore, great guy, great book, recommended to all the Masons.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, his focus was primarily New York, but
right.
He still had a lot of insights, even into the Windsor Masonic Temple and Masonic temples in general.
And, one of the things that I've really, just since doing the research on our building, was really, it really, unfortunately, started, kind of an obsession, a little bit of an obsession about, collecting, imagery related to, these buildings. And, I've completely lost count of how many postcards I've acquired. But what's that?
What was it about postcards? The Windsor Masonic Temple had a postcard. I've noticed it seems like a lot of these Masonic temples, when they were looking at possible souvenirs or swag to give out, postcards seems to be a pretty common thing. I've noticed they're not as cool as drink koozies, but they're still. It just seems like it's such a pretty common. Was it just easy to produce, or?
It was really easy to produce. There were kind of the golden age of postcards was really, in the first couple of decades of the 20th century. It might even be like, I'd say about 1900 and 1920 was like really kind of the height when they became really, really artistic. And actually, quite an amazing document of some buildings that we wouldn't otherwise have documentation of, because they've either been lost over the years, or the interiors in particular, have been so changed over time and put into other uses. And so they were a very popular souvenir. I've seen types where, it's a photographic reproduction of the building plans, and the postcards were sold as a fundraiser to go toward the building fund. I've seen some, like you mentioned, that were sold as souvenirs. There's one postcard that I have in my collection of uh, the Yakima, Washington Masonic Temple, which is this wedding cake of an early 20th century extravaganza of a like 8-story Masonic building. It's
What
incredible.
about this is something I've been kind of thinking on a lot lately, for my own selfish reasons, because I've got some that I'm selling through Square and Compass for the podcast. But scale model reproductions of temples. Have you managed to come across any of those?
Oh, the actual like the miniature buildings that used to be produced. I have not. I think the only one there might have been some for the George Washington Memorial in Alexandria, Virginia, but I have not actually come across any.
Well, because I might as well take a minute to show it off. Oh, hey, sweet, there it is. Just because I'm proud of them, because nobody seems to do it, and I don't understand why. So
look at that.
This is the Windsor Masonic Temple.
Oh, look at that.
7 by 7, and actually it's hollow underneath, and the windows are see-through, so it can light up from the inside.
Oh, that's incredible. That's absolutely incredible.
Produced by Global 3D Arts in Kansas. If anybody wants them, it's through the Square and Compass Patreon page. But also, if anybody's watching this who is with the Masonic Temple, and if you have a unique building, I'd recommend looking into it, because it's there's a lot of interest for it, and a lot of people are looking at getting one. And it's just a really cool, I don't know, it seems to me like a no-brainer. If you're building it, especially in your own city, like if your Masonic Temple has any kind of public space for weddings, for receptions, for dances, people might want a memento of the building that they got married in, or had a high school dance in, or something to that effect. Just seems like something, and every time I check with the Masonic Temple, they tell me that they've never done it themselves. So I can't have been the first one to think of it, I don't think.
It's I think it's a great idea. And the model looks awesome. It reminds me very much of Seattle's old Central Masonic Temple, which still exists. Unfortunately, it's closed now. It's a theater, and it's closed. I've always wanted to see the inside of it, but no, I mean that's pretty great. I think it's all about exploring. I think a lot of us are just kind of naturally curious, and I mean some of the architecture of some of these buildings is just, I'm not sure. It might be interfering with my camera.
Got a bit of shine. Oh, there we go. All right.
Yeah. It's
all
like
right,
some of these buildings are just like, if you propose this now, like, I mean, would anybody construct it? I mean, it's wild, right? I mean, some of them are just really off the wall.
No, I agree. There's so many that are. It's I think, and I'm guessing you would agree, I think we really take these buildings for granted.
Yes.
I constantly hear, it's the people, not the building, but I'm not so sure that's completely true. It doesn't have to be one or the other. It can be, both are important, right? And both matter.
I definitely agree with you. And I don't want to go too far down that particular rabbit hole, but you bring up a very, very good point. And it's that so many of trying to find one of the recent acquisitions. It's a really good one. I definitely agree with you that I think that we've given really short shrift, to some of these buildings. And, this, for instance, is a picture of the interior of the lodge room of that Yakima Masonic Temple that I was talking about, which fortunately is a hotel now. The building was saved, but it's not a Masonic building anymore. But I mean, some of the architectural masterpieces that we're really dealing with are really quite stunning. These buildings also used to be, just landmarks within their community, and they weren't just used by Masons. They were used by all sorts of other organizations because typically, in many cases, it was either the Masonic building or the Oddfellows Hall, or maybe one other fraternal order that had a building, and it was the largest meeting space, where a group of people could gather. And I definitely agree with you that I think that much has been said about how, the concept of a lodge is greater. It's just the people, and it doesn't really have anything to do with the building. And actually, I would say, particularly in this ongoing pandemic, I believe that the role of our buildings is even more important than ever, simply because virtual meeting can only go so far. We can't do the esoteric work, so we can, pretty much just keep it purely social. But I believe we all are looking forward to going back into our respective, lodges, be they, humble, simple structures, like some of the historic landmarks here in King County, which are still operated as Masonic lodges, or some of the grander edifices like your one in Windsor. But I just think that unfortunately buildings are expensive, and buildings need maintenance, and they need seismic upgrades, particularly on the West Coast, and it's just the problems are very large and costly. And even fairly recently, it's like one of our Grand Lodge officers, once again broached the topic of potentially combining, lodge buildings and selling off real estate, just for that very purpose. But I just think that, with each building that we lose, I think we lose more and more of our collective history of North American Freemasonry. I mean, it's not just Canadian. It's not just, it's Canada. It's the United States, Alaska, Hawaii. It's just they're not building they're not building buildings like this anymore. Is probably the best way to sum it up.
And there's such equity in the buildings too. It doesn't have to be, wherever wherever a lodge meets, wherever their temple is, whether it's a grand edifice like the Windsor Masonic Temple, or Goderich, which it kind of owns a building and it meets on the top floor, and then it's got shop space down below, to temples, lodges that they meet in some tiny little, like Port Stanley, it's on the second floor of a building, and 50 people, and I'm pretty sure in violation of a fire code. I remember I was there for 200 people. But the thing is, once you lose wherever it is you're meeting, you can't get it back. And do you really want to, all the equity, all the money that was put into it, first of all, are you ever going to be able to get that back in a sale, which I'd highly question. And also, you then have to try to rebuild, your memories. People come to Masonic Temple for years because it's a Masonic home. Are they going to feel the same way going to a brand new building? It's one thing for them to move to a new city for work or whatever it is, and then seek out a new Masonic home there. But to have your Masonic home moved on you, even if you say at the time you think it might be a good idea, are you going to feel that way when you have to go to this new place you're not used to? It just seems to me there's so many more downsides than upsides.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. You know, I mean, one of the reasons why my research has been so difficult, I mean, kind of my ongoing research efforts, one of the reasons it's so difficult is because in some cases the records don't exist, and in some cases the buildings no longer exist. So I can't go and visit them. But I definitely would agree with you. I think that some of the images that I've come across, one of my favorite ones, is a postcard of the Masonic Temple in Redfield, South Dakota, from 1909, which was built the same year as ours. And the gentleman wrote on the back, "This is the temple I helped to build last fall." And it's this beautiful brick building, and obviously pride. There's pride that went into that. Masons being not just speculative but also operative Masons. But yeah, I think that we we are told to preserve the ancient landmarks, but I'm not sure if we've done a great job of actually preserving our physical landmarks.
I agree completely. I worry just in Masonically in general, speaking for the not that I'm anybody of importance, but speaking for the craft as a whole, to see the number of buildings that have been lost. New York, Chicago, um, are the two that come to mind most obviously. Toronto, here in Canada, um, Winnipeg, if I recall correctly. To see, the history that gets lost and then becomes, and new tenants to these buildings will make some efforts to preserve some of the history. I know in Chicago, for example, in the Masonic Temple that was in the Loop, um, it's now a theater, the Oriental Theater. They do have they kept the square and compasses on the facade, so you can see them if you're outside. But then you go to the South Masonic Temple and it's torn down, right? It's just an empty lot now. So there's just such a risk of trying to move on when we have such beautiful and amazing properties already. This is something it's kind of a hobby horse of mine. I worry about it. I'm not an architect by any means, but I love, I can recognize a beautiful building when I see it and recognize the importance of it.
Yeah, I mean, and that's I totally agree, and it really is, just out of my own curiosity, as a historic architect, as an architectural historian, and through my website, where I try to push out as much research as I can. It's to push it out. It's to really gather it up and to put it out there before it's lost. And I mean, especially the pandemic. I mean, has really just kind of underscored how difficult communication is and how difficult it is accessing archives and resources. So um, I, I think that we're kind of at a critical point right now, where I think there's a lot of discussion about what the physical environment is going to look like for a lot of our lodges. So it's a challenge that lodges both large and small face.
I've got a significant number of interviews and podcasts on the on this topic. I'll send them your way, certainly,
Great.
and I'll put them up on the corner of the screen. I got so the interview with William Moore, which was one I really enjoyed. The original blueprints from the Masonic Temple, which I reviewed. I also spoke with a gentleman from Edmonton Lodge in Edmonton, Alberta. He's with Boreas Architectural and Design, and he does heritage restoration in Alberta. We talked about a lot of these same things, and then working with National Trust and APT, the American, was it the Association for Preservation Technologies. I went
Right.
to their virtual conference and did some videos about that. Um, but yeah, it's great. It's always nice to meet another brother who's as interested or as passionate about these buildings, because I agree with you 100%. What do you think? Like, imagining, putting on our crazy hat where do you see some solutions to some of these potential problems? Putting aside maybe the pandemic for a minute, because that presents
Absolutely.
its but even before the pandemic, there were challenges that we were with heritage properties, with older properties. I've heard arguments about dues and assessments and them being too low versus lowering them to attract new membership. I've heard lots of different discussion on these problems. Do you have any thoughts on solutions? And by all means, the crazier the better, because that's more fun for podcasts.
I think that it definitely does depend on each individual property, and I think each individual property has kind of its own quirks and foibles. There's challenges that we face on the West Coast that aren't really faced in other parts of the country. The biggest problem that we face on the West Coast is, of course, unreinforced masonry buildings, which is of particular concern to us because our buildings are assembly spaces, and so they are hazardous buildings. It's kind of interesting, that you asked that question, because our lodge building association right now is looking at potential seismic retrofit of our building, and of course the topic of how to pay for it, comes up. Some of my ideas, really extends to just kind of the structural framework of how real estate is treated within Freemasonry. I'm not entirely sure how it is typically handled in Canada, but here in the United States, frequently, and this may even vary quite a bit, from Grand Lodge to Grand Lodge, but speaking for the Grand Lodge of Washington, there's the lodge as a corporate entity, and then there's the building association as a separate corporate entity that is comprised of members from the lodge and perhaps other organizations that meet in that building. So you have the quote unquote temple board, and then you have, the actual, Masons that are meeting in that space. I think some of my ideas are really, number one, we need to undertake a survey of what our resources are at perhaps the Masonic district level, excuse me, and perhaps at the kind of the regional Grand Lodge level, to really to think strategically about which geographic centers are going to continue to be geographic centers of an area, and where people are going to be able to commute to and from relatively easily. So I think number one is to identify what we have, and that's part of the work that I'm doing is just kind of putting this information out there and seeing who picks it up and runs with it. But I think that there's some buildings that we have that are of varying levels of significance. Okay, some are very, very significant, and some perhaps not so significant. And so, using the results of that survey to really kind of think strategically about, okay, we understand that we've got some smaller lodges that need to consolidate, bring them together into one facility. And then number two is to look at the form that those facilities take. And I think that, particularly in some of the busier cities on the West Coast, the 2- and 3-story building with the retail on the ground floor and the lodge above, I don't think that it can bring in enough income just as a standalone retail entity helping to pay for the building. I think that the cost is just too great. And so what I think, kind of pie in the sky, and what I've talked about with some of the brethren of our lodge is the possibility of looking a little bit bigger. And then if we're going to do a seismic retrofit of the building, it's like, could we maybe talk with a developer who's experienced in redeveloping properties and look at some of the, look at possibly expanding the footprint of some of our facilities so that you can, create a viable, excuse me, a viable real estate redevelopment and rehabilitation of the building. But, it really, there has to be a long-term income producer for the building. And I think that some sort of mixed use scenario, I think, could end up being much more sustainable. It's not a new discussion. Our lodge actually talked about doing this back in the mid 1960s. Ultimately didn't do it. We were going to build a large lodge and then high-rise apartment building, so that we would have had a high-rise apartment building to bring in income, there in the university district. So, that's kind of my thinking is that, initially just this two-step approach. Number one, identify what we have, and then number two, how can we best utilize the assets that we have? And I think number three on that is, just the execution and the moving forward of these plans, and really just, I think one of the challenges that, each of these individual temple boards and these lodges face at kind of the granular lodge level is the fact that they don't know who to turn to, they don't know who to trust. They've got questions that they need answered, and typically, the people who they ask these questions of, want to charge large amounts of money to do studies and all this stuff, and it's like there's just not a centralized, kind of think tank, knowledge bank, brain trust to really kind of help out a lot of these organizations, and they just kind of flail around, through no fault of their own. They've got great intentions. They want to do right by the building, and they just don't know how to proceed. They don't have the technical expertise and the financial expertise. So I think that's kind of my three-step pie in the sky, throw it out there and see what sticks kind of approach.
Well, I very much hope that sticks myself, because I agree with that. I think, now is the time to be, especially now that our meetings are in-person meetings are suspended. I mean, now is the time to be reevaluating and thinking more maybe outside the box. Why not? There's never any benefit, in my opinion, to saying no to an idea. You always want to say yes, and then during the researching phase, you figure out how can it work, how won't it work, and you modify it. But the initial, I think the old joke about the past master, right? That's not how we did it in my day. That can apply to the buildings too, right? Sometimes you want to at least say, okay, we'll consider this, and then you can always, when it's just the idea stage, you can always modify as necessary. But if you don't start thinking a bit more outside the box, then just we all see the trend lines,
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think one of the really telling arguments that I always hear, when people talk about meeting at one building over meeting at another building, and they always say, well, parking is just so hard. Parking is so hard. It's like there's no place to park, and it's like, and I just shake my head, and I'm like, University Lodge meets 1 block away from a light rail station that's going to open, here within the next few months. It's like you could get from there to any other part of the city, and you don't have to worry about parking a car. And the way that some of these guys take some hospitality after the meetings, they don't have any business driving afterwards anyway. But anyway, I mean, it's.
No, I know what you're saying for sure on that one.
Not all of us have cars, it's like, some people actually do utilize public transportation, but.
It just goes back to just the times, right? Like, saying the Windsor Masonic Temple is located right, the bus stops right outside the door. You step out and you're there. So I agree completely. It's about looking at what you've got and how to make it work. One more time, because I love showing this off. This is what Square and Compass has. If you're interested in it through
Cool.
through the patron page, I can have it sent right to you. And actually, the cool thing is, right now, so this is just one of the standard models. So it's got the sign. See if you can see it, where it says Masonic Temple.
Nice. Yeah.
And then it's very small, but it's actually got the phone number here where you can book. So if you
Nice.
but I can actually get a custom, something written on the sign that's custom. So I had a wife purchase one for her husband, and she wrote "Love you forever" on the sign. That's, I guess, they're saying. So you can get a custom, something written custom on the sign if you don't want it to say Masonic Temple. Love you, mom and dad, or whatever it is. So yeah, Global 3D Arts. I'll give them a shout out again. But I'm sure most cities, Seattle would have something like a 3D printing shop or something that could. It's just a matter of getting, and it sounds like you've done a lot of the work. It's just a matter of getting those original blueprints and taking a sufficient number of pictures, and they kind of work. I am going to remind everybody else also, please hit the subscribe button, the like button, leave a comment, all that good stuff. And with that, Brother Adam Alsobrook, thank you so much. I very much enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Worshipful Brother Adamson.